So, Yeats's slow admission of a female element of consciousness was a painful process, as it is for most men. No wonder, therefore, that these elements would emerge in a raw and even brutal state, having been denied for decades, kept below the level of male consciousness. No wonder that Yeats was unnerved by the raw, unruly language of Jane when her voice broke through. Yeats wrote in a letter to his wife, with apparent surprise, "I want to exorcise that slut, Crazy Jane. Her language has become unendurable." But I think that Yeats also got sanction for this use of the female voice in Gaelic tradition, because Gaelic poets often wrote in the persona of a woman who was married to a particular chieftain. And the Gaelic poet asked for the privilege of sharing the chieftain's bed. In an elegy for a dead chieftain, for instance, one poet laments, "Bos an leach relagadlum," the death of the warrior who lay with me. And the scholar Jim Carney suggested that one of the most famous of all old Gaelic poems, The Hag of Bear, is really, it appears to describe a sluttish old woman recalling with gusto the sins of her youth and preparing for death, a pious death in a monastery. But he thinks this was written by a man, and that it's really the poet expressing all his past involvement and flings with various kings through the person of an old harlot who, after a good spring, summer and autumn, as he says, finds herself rejected by her former patrons in the early months of winter. Now, I think the ways in which all this could help explain the Crazy Jane poems are obvious, particularly Crazy Jane talks with the bishop. The bishop advises her to seek God and a heavenly mansion, but he remains fixated on her body, those breasts, those veins, in such a way as to suggest that he may actually be courting her all over again and urging her to die in the Elizabethan sense of the word die. The poem, like the other Crazy Jane poems in this style, it reads like Yeats's challenge to the censorship laws against obscenity, which were already overtaking the Irish Free State. Jane insists that the self and soul are not opposites. Foul and fair need one another. All dreams of soul end up incarnated in a fleshly body, because God possesses the heavens but really covets the earth. So in the final stanza, the third stanza, it's unclear whether the speaker is Jane or the bishop or indeed a third party. A woman can be proud and stiff. That stiff is a very interesting, possibly masculine word for a woman to be uttering. A woman can be proud and stiff when on love intent, but love has pitched his mansion in the place of excrement. For nothing can be soul or whole that has not been rent. Now that love is love with a capital L, and it reflects that the organs of sex, inter urinas et feces, are those of excrement and death. It's another example of Adam's curse, when God says, "I will make their places of love excrementitious." But those lines could also be about a God who possesses heaven but wants to take human form. Love has pitched his mansion in the place of excrement, which is why I think it could be the bishop who is speaking that final stanza. In Yeats's poetry, questions about sex and questions about religion are always closely related. So, for instance, the words soul and whole could also betoken soul, S-O-U-L, rather than S-O-L-E, and whole, H-O-L-E, rather than W-H-O-L-E. So you get the obscene and the holy in one gesture to indicate the violence that precedes sexual unification. This is one reason why I think Yeats was so delighted on the publication of D.H. Lawrence's now famous book, Lady Chatterley's Lover, because he found a similar mingling of discourses there. He wrote an amazing paragraph about it. He said, "The coarse language of the gamekeeper, accepted across the social divide by the lady, becomes for him a forlorn poetry uniting their solitudes, something ancient, humble and terrible." You can just hear Yeats saying ancient and humble and terrible. And he said that the sexual elements in the book, which had been asserted by Lawrence, were an assertion against the abstraction of the modern age, which he felt dead from the waist downward. Now, you could have predicted Yeats's adoption of the female persona when you think that he believed growth is only possible to a self that puts on its anti-self, puts on what is its opposite nature. By nature, Yeats felt himself as a young man, emotional, soft and warm, So he tried to make himself impervious, hard, and cold. The male takes on female elements, for as Swedenborg says, those who are truly married on earth become in heaven one angel. Yeats was haunted by the fact that God chose a first home as holy infant among the beasts in the filthy stable at Bethlehem. This is, I think, the meaning of that line about the uncontrollable mystery on the bestial floor in his poem about the Magi. Now, in 1926, the Christian Brothers publicly burnt a magazine which they said contained horrible insult to God and the Holy Family. And this was the famous Cherry Tree Carol, in which a baffled Joseph chides the pregnant Mary. Up spake Joseph with his words so unkind, let them gather cherries that have brought thee with child. Then up spake the little child in his mother's womb, lay down, you sweet cherry tree, and give my mother some. There is the whole mystery, said Yeats, God in the indignity of human birth. I have thought it out over and over again, and I can see no reason for the anger of the Christian Brothers, except that they do not believe in the incarnation. They think they believe in it, but they do not. And its sudden presentation fills them with fear, and to hide their fear, they turn on the poem.